People of downtown Yarmouth why he's trying to fool them into thinking that this government cares about their plight.
Now, Minister of Economic Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, as the honourable member would know, this government supports all communities, Yarmouth and throughout Nova Scotia, and especially rural communities. In relationship to what the honourable member has put forward to the House, obviously the honourable member does appreciate a proper tender form that is released to the public and business people for the expression of interest.
Now, Member Key Britton Nova, your final supplementary.
So much for the proper tender form, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, let me remind the Minister, who is also the Minister for Economic Development, of a simple economic fact. If you remove a key business from a downtown area, you will harm the businesses there. And Yarmouth is not the only downtown in the province's target for the removal of liquor stores. Rick Perkins, the Vice President of Marketing Communications for the NSLC, said in a radio interview yesterday that the Crown Corporation is in the middle of making this move all over the province. Mr. Speaker, downtown areas are being hollowed out all over Nova Scotia. Rather than helping, here is a government-owned business that is hurting downtowns. My question is, why is the Minister not prepared to stand up for what is best for downtown areas across Nova Scotia?
Now, Minister of Economic Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, the honourable member again appears to be confused because this government is there to support businesses and business opportunities to employ Nova Scotians in every community. I would remind the honourable member, if he checks his facts on the website, there's 2 liquor stores will be announced in Yarmouth rather than 1. I would suggest 2 outlets are much better than 1.
Now, member for Glace Bay.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health, Mr. Speaker. Recently, I met with Janice MacDonald of Glace Bay to discuss some serious concerns over the inability of home care in Nova Scotia to provide care for her husband at home. Joey MacDonald is 37 years old and on a portable ventilator after being diagnosed with ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease, in 2003. He has 3 young children, Renee, 12, Ryan, 10, and Colin, 2, and they would dearly love to be a part of their father's life on a daily basis. There are 3 people alone, Mr. Speaker, in Cape Breton with home ventilators who are receiving care at home. 2 of those individuals have full-time, round-the-clock care through home care, yet no one seems to be willing to help Joey. My question for the Minister, Mr. Speaker, why is there no consistency when it comes to the provision of home care for ALS patients in this province?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member would appreciate I'm not at liberty to get involved with the details of individual cases, but I can assure the honourable member that every effort is made to apply the policies of the Department of Health in an equitable manner throughout this province, and any change from that would suggest maybe due to other circumstances that are beyond the capacity of the Department of Health or the DHA to control. I want to assure the honourable member that the disease to which he refers is one which is very devastating, and we are very cognizant of the need to provide the proper and appropriate care to those individuals in the best way that we can.
The Honourable Member for Glace Bay on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I know that the Minister is aware of this case personally, and so is your department. The problem is that home care has been sadly neglected by this government, and it's acute care that is paying the price because of that. Joey has been in an intensive care unit bed since November of last year, occupying a critical care bed that the healthcare system needs at a cost of over $1,200 a day. They want to put Joey now in a step-down unit in the hospital, and they want him to stay there probably for the rest of his life. And Joey's wife, Janice, Mr. Speaker, is a registered nurse. She does her best for her husband, but she can't do it alone. Mr. Speaker, my question then for the Minister, why is it not possible for anyone in home care to develop a joint care plan so that Joey can get care at home like other ALS patients in this province?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for bringing this very serious matter forward with respect to the family involved. And I can assure the honourable member that I have very personal experience with that disease. In our family, we cared for my mother-in-law and cared for her until such time as we were not able to do it in our own home, and unfortunately had to see her go to the hospital where she spent the remainder of her life. But I do know that she was very well cared for when she was in the hospital. And that, Mr. Speaker, is our objective with respect to all of these patients, to ensure that they get the very best care that we can possibly provide for them.
The honourable member for Glace Bay on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, Joey McDonald is 37 years old and looking for fair treatment in this province. We have a home care program that provides 24/7 care for some ALS patients, but it's unwilling to provide support for others. Acute care budgets that are out of control, Mr. Minister, because this government has a home care program that has been neglected and it's inflexible. And we have a spouse who's a trained RN who's both willing and able to provide care, but no one is willing to help her. Mr. Speaker, my question for the minister, can he explain the rationale for not providing support for the McDonalds, which would no doubt save the healthcare system money? It would ensure a better quality of life. Mr. Minister, why won't you let Joey go home?
The honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The situation to which the honourable member refers is a situation that on the surface is not as simple as he would suggest that it is, because to do what he is requesting requires considerable infrastructure to be able to be provided in that home. And that is a real challenge, to be able to provide the appropriate level of infrastructure. Mr. Speaker, we are working with the District Health Authority to provide a more appropriate environment within the hospital setting for patients who suffer from ALS and are in the circumstances described by the honourable member.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As you will know, Mr. Speaker, many of the secondary roads in this province are in deplorable condition. And one such road that I've become quite familiar with is Highway 256 in Pictou County through Linesbrook and Scottsburn into West Branch and through to Colchester County. The road is heaved, it's potholed, it's cracked, and it's broken. And the actual structural integrity of the roadbed is gone and looks as if the road hasn't been touched in decades. I got some pictures here I'm going to show. I want to table, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. Order, please. No props allowed in the House. You can certainly table a document.
Actual conditions of that particular road. And people there have come to me and they're asking, why is the road in such poor shape? And the only answer I can give them is that the road is so bad because this government has neglected it, and previous governments before them have made the decision to let it get this bad. So my question to the Minister of Transportation, why is it that in 2005, residents, not just there, but right across this province, have to put up with such horrible roads?
Honourable Minister of Transportation and Public Works.
Well, I don't know about Pictou County, Mr. Speaker, but I know that in Shubenacadie, Sam came out and he didn't see his shadow and spring arrived. And when the spring came, the snow melted and the ice melted and the frost came out of the ground. And, Mr. Speaker, that's been going on for the honourable member's attention for about the last 10,000 years, I guess. I mean, you get potholes. And, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, what you learn when you take Highway 101 is that you can't repair potholes in the wintertime, and you can't repair potholes in the early spring. But however, a little later in the spring, the Department of Highways will be out there and will be looking after the potholes.
Now, member for Pictou West on your first supplementary.
Well, thanks for the antidotes, Mr. Minister, but Mr. Speaker, this time I'd like to go on and ask the Premier this question. I guess, Mr. Premier, as a fellow Pictonian, I'm sure you're familiar with Highway 256. And in February, we held a public meeting in the community of West Branch. We had over 100 people there that very, very concerned wanting improvements on Highway 256. And since then, there's been hundreds of people have signed petitions. And actually, the Highway 256 Improvement Committee has been established to lobby for repaving on that road. So, Mr. Premier, they're looking for a plan. They're looking for a plan to repair not just their road, but a plan for all roads in this province. A plan that will tell them when their road is going to be repaired and where it is on the priority list. So, Mr. Premier, I'd like to ask, what is your plan to deal with Highway 256, and where does it stand on the government's priority list?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I share the member opposite's concern about the shape of bridges and highways in rural Nova Scotia. We certainly have a tremendous challenge in addressing all of the road issues that are present in our province. We do take very seriously the complaints of Pictonians and all Nova Scotians living in the rural parts of the province when the road infrastructure is falling below an acceptable standard. I do take the concerns of the people living along 256 very seriously. At their invitation, I did drive the highway 2 weeks ago, and I can confirm the member's observation that the road needs some work.
Member for Pictou West, on your final supplementary.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. So we know the road needs some work, and the next question is when it's going to be done. That's the question I'm being asked daily by residents along Highway 256. Residents are facing higher bills for car repairs and have legitimate concerns over safety for themselves and for their children that travel on the school buses. But what they want is a plan, and they want to know that the plan will be free of politics. They'll take the politics out of paving, and they're tired of the idea that when elections come along that all of a sudden Santa Claus comes along and says we're going to pave your road. It's not the way to go. So my question this time to the Minister of Transportation, when will this government leave politics behind and develop a priority list open to public scrutiny?
Honourable Minister of Transportation, Public Works.
Mr. Speaker, if there's one thing I can say about the present administration is that we do indeed divide the highway dollars that are available for both capital and operational purposes, Mr. Speaker, evenly across the whole province.
The Honourable Member for Victoria the Lakes. The Honourable Member for Victoria the Lakes.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Transportation. Mr. Speaker, 2 weeks ago, our caucus and our leader, Francis McKenzie, launched a website called Neglected Road of the Week. The launch was in response to unsolicited submissions from the public appalled by the state of the neglected roads. Today, I want to draw the Minister's attention to Como Road in the community of Fort Ellis, Colchester County. Mr. Speaker, and I wish to table the picture I have of that. As can be seen by this is a huge sinkhole, Mr. Speaker, which is in danger of anyone traveling on the road. My question to the Minister, why does the government continue to neglect Como Road in Fort Ellis?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation, Public Works. Order. Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Transportation, Public Works has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the history of that party and highways is well known right across this province. About 90% of the problems we have in the highway system today were generated by their lack of attention to the highways from 1993 to 2000. About $40 million on capital on highways. They dropped from about $80 million in 1990, and today we're spending $160 million in 2005 on the highway system.
Honourable Member for Victoria the Lakes, on your first supplementary.
I don't want to get into too much verbal diatribe, but it sounds like if that $160 million is being spent not in the ridings that I travel. Mr. Speaker, a grown man can be seen standing in the pothole or in the sinkhole. Maybe what I'll do is I'll try some flowery language like the Honourable Minister of Energy, and we'll dispose of potholes, because they're a seasonal thing. They come and they go. We'll call them now traction ruts, because if you go into one, you need all the traction or a tractor to get yourself out of it, Mr. Speaker. Maybe that's the language we should use. So my first supplementary to the Minister, as I said, a small car could disappear in the sinkhole. Why will the Minister commit? Will the Minister commit today to undertake a permanent and immediate construction project to fix this problem? This sinkhole has been there for 3 weeks to date, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Transportation and Public Works.
Mr. Speaker, the Department of Transportation is aware of the sinkhole and is taking steps to repair that particular problem.
Victoria Lakes on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Minister mentioned about what was done in the previous government. This government has had 6 years to repair the potholes. Mr. Speaker, so far the only response from the Department of Transportation of the Como Road is to put up a few barriers. Mr. Speaker?
Order, please. The Honourable Member Victoria Lakes has the floor.
The neglect to the Como Road on behalf of the residents there, and do it immediately.
The Honourable Minister of Transportation and Public Works.
Mr. Speaker, I've only got 15 seconds? 50. Oh, 50. Well, that's good. because, Mr. Speaker, I cannot emphasize enough that this government has moved steadily on highway reconstruction, repair, and construction over the past 6 years, faster than any other government probably in the history of Nova Scotia. And we have increased by the RIM program. We have increased the summer and winter maintenance programs, and we have increased the capital program. Mr. Speaker, for the first time in history, we're moving forward insofar as highways are concerned in Nova Scotia.
Now, Member Cape Breton Nova, you have about 5 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Hello, Mr. Speaker. I guess it's not...
Order, please. Order, please. Time allotted question period has expired. Government business, the Honourable Government House Leader.
Speaker, would you please call the order of business public bills for second reading?
Public bills for second reading.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, would you please call bill number... Oops, where are we here? Would you please call bill number... is it 145 is the first one? Bill 145.
Bill number 145. The Honourable Minister of Education.
Just repeating that message and getting it into the public.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I rise on behalf of my colleague, the Minister of Justice, to move second reading of Bill 145. As my colleague said yesterday at the bill briefing, this legislation is an important step forward in ensuring an effective enumeration/confirmation process and promoting the development of current and more accurate voters' lists for our citizens. These amendments, Mr. Speaker, also recognize the need to have access to additional sources of information from which to maintain our Made in Nova Scotia permanent list of electors. Ongoing updating of lists by returning officers and elections office staff between elections is recognized in the bill as a critical aspect to ensure that lists are up to date. Further, the amendments also require that the Chief Electoral Officer provide a consolidated list of electors to recognize political parties annually to help the parties stay better informed. The bill also takes care of some administrative matters, including allowing returning offices to be secured earlier than at present and in ensuring fair reimbursement of candidates based on the final list of electors, including those who have voted on election day. Finally, the bill removes the prohibition against inmates serving 2 years or more in custody from exercising the right to vote as determined by the courts. Mr. Speaker, this bill results from the work done by the Election Commission to assess the problems encountered in the 2003 provincial election. The Election Commission is, as you know, a three-party statutory body created under the Elections Act to advise the Chief Electoral Officer in the administrative conduct of elections. All of these amendments stem from the work of that commission, and it is to be commended for its effort. Mr. Speaker, with those few remarks, I'm pleased to move second reading of Bill 145.
Thank you. Recognize the honourable member for Cole Harbour, Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wanted to take a few minutes on behalf of my caucus to speak with regard to Bill number 145. Mr. Speaker, some may know that there's actually a bit of an understanding unique in this province with regard to the Elections Act, that the three recognized political parties will ensure that the Electoral Commission that we all have equal membership on will present to the Chief Electoral Officer a united front with regard to changes. And it's taken a couple years since the 2003 election, Mr. Speaker, but at that time, I think all the parties were clearly sending signals to their representatives on the Electoral Commission that the permanent list, the federal list, was not working. And I think every member of this House can speak volumes with regard to anecdotes in their riding. I just want to take a minute to speak about a few of them in my area. And I want to say my experience isn't only with the provincial election, but obviously with two federal elections, the 2000 election and the 2004 election, Mr. Speaker, federal elections. And in particular, I will say, this is interesting, because when I was at the press conference last week, and the member from Clare and the Minister of Justice were there as well, it was interesting how it came up, what percentage of mistakes were on the list, or what percentage of people were missing. In rural areas, they seem to think it was 10 or 15%. In urban areas, more transient areas, and that would include mine and many others in this House, Mr. Speaker, the number is actually much higher. I would predict it was 25 or 33%, because we actually saw situations where there were whole streets that weren't on the list. New streets, sometimes not that new, but that were removed from the list. Or I've seen situations, Mr. Speaker, where half a street was on one side of the street was on the list and the other side of the street wasn't. And partly, I think one of the biggest problems with this federal list that we were using, Mr. Speaker, was that it was based on people having to acknowledge on their tax return that they wanted to have their name on a registered list of voters. And of course, I can't think of a worse time to ask Canadians and ask Nova Scotians, do you want to be on a voters list, than when they have to fill out their tax return. Because I would suggest to you, probably more than any other time, they're seeing red with regard to government and the taxes they have to pay. And at that time, we're supposed to be asking them, do you want to be on a voters list so that the government knows where you are? Well, are we surprised to find that most people, or a good chunk of the people, Mr. Speaker, decided not to put their name on the list? I don't think we should be surprised. So by moving to a provincial list, by moving to our own list, the province has probably good, if not better, records with regard to where people are. And those records, obviously, driver's license is a clear example of one that is primary. But there are people who don't have driver's licenses, but there's still ways that we can identify them. And there are different records that the province has. And by using that combination of various records in the provincial database, we actually are going to be able to produce a fairly accurate list of people who and where they're voting and where they live, Mr. Speaker. And I think that is important. But that permanent list, and this is what I like about the system that we're proposing here today, Mr. Speaker, isn't just that permanent list. It allows for the Chief Electoral Officer and the returning officers in each riding to go out and do enumeration, not only to add names, because I can speak in my area of development where there's new streets on a yearly basis, that they would have to go out and actually fill in who's living on those streets. But also, Mr. Speaker, to go back to the other areas to confirm who is or who is not on the list. And I think a sort of a side effect, a benefit of this is, and someone suggested this to me, that in a shorter campaign, there may be a tendency for people not to know there's an election until the near very end, when they start getting a flood of leaflets and advertising. But the whole benefit of a sort of a side effect and a benefit of enumeration, Mr. Speaker, is that it allows people who are not campaigning on behalf of any particular candidate or party to go out door to door and just remind people early on in the first 5 or 10 days that there is an election on. And that may in itself just give people that impetus to know, okay, I have a responsibility as a citizen of Nova Scotia to actually focus. And by having that person come to their door or receiving a slip of paper that reminds them of this, that might be a way of helping to instill a few more people are voting. And you know, in a province where the voting rate is going down, Mr. Speaker, consistently in the last few years, I think that's an important side effect that we should be happy to see. But enumeration is not only adding names or addressing names or revising names, but confirmation as well, Mr. Speaker. So I see a benefit to that. And these are things that, quite frankly, I like what we're proposing here. Obviously, this is something that after the next election we'll have to go back and review to see whether it's working, whether there's a need to tinker with it again. But at this point, any system that combines enumeration, confirmation with a permanent list, I think is good. The other part of this is, and maybe many in this House don't know that, but we're going to, each riding association in each constituency is going to get a yearly list of the voters in that riding. And there will be an update every year that will be presented to each riding association, or at least to each party, who will then distribute it to their riding associations, Mr. Speaker. So there'll be an opportunity to have a fairly accurate database when the election starts. Because you may recall, as I know as a candidate, and I'm sure many others here do too, that you have to wait to have a fairly accurate list, 10, 15 days. But our campaigns are only 28 days long now. So having at least some semblance of a list that's going to be updated at least gives us something we can start with early on in the campaign, so we're not sitting around, I'm sure none of us are twiddling our thumbs, but at least waiting for a permanent list, Mr. Speaker. So I see these as benefits. I want to talk a bit about also the returning officers, because it's been hinted, and I'm not sure how much is in the Act and how much will just be through regulation or through policy, but I get the sense we're moving towards full-time or at least returning officers that are employed longer than 30 days. Or 60 days or 90 days, depending on the length of their job, Mr. Speaker. Right now, our returning officer is clearly a part-time job where they start a few days or at the time of an election, work through an election, and then work the 30 days after in order to verify the voting and confirm the voting and the ballots, and then signing off, Mr. Speaker. And I think that this changes to the Elections Act will ensure that these returning officers are doing the job on a regular basis, yearly, maybe monthly. I'm not sure what was actually proposed. Maybe we'll hear at law amendments. But some form of longer-term commitment that allowed. Now, there'll be a cost to that, I understand, but at the same time, having these returning officers doing a job on a regular basis, yearly, monthly, would at least ensure that we're going to have some system. Again, lists being updated on an annual basis, people who are in the community updating those lists, who know the communities on a fairly well basis, Mr. Speaker. So I think that those are good things. We talk about the inmates. I think the Minister of Education, on behalf of the Minister of Justice, noted that. I want to say that obviously this is a Supreme Court of Canada decision that said that inmates in institutions that are there for more than 2 years have the right to vote. All we're doing here is legislating what the Supreme Court of Canada has already said had to be done. So I don't see any real issue with that. And I do want to commend as well on behalf of my party, not only our members, but all members of the Electoral Commission, Mr. Speaker, because that Electoral Commission, and I will say this, I think did a very good job of taking what in many cases was just sort of an esoteric complaint. I know I was one of the people in the media early on after the election on behalf of my party complaining about the list. I'm sure others were as well. They took those complaints, those nondescript complaints in some cases, and turned that into policy and into recommendations that the Chief Electoral Officer was able to use, and now we see this coming forward. And I think all these things, are, including a new Chief Electoral Officer in Ms. Christine McCullough, I think are good signs that we do have an electoral system that can work. And I think that's important, not only because obviously as elected officials, this is how we get elected, but something that I've noted in the past and I would like to put on the record here, Mr. Speaker, if we don't make those changes, if we don't make the changes that are in Bill number 145, we really do risk having a system that is vulnerable to electoral fraud. And I'm sure none of the parties or no members of this House would be involved in that, Mr. Speaker. But you do have, when you look at, and in my constituency, I had people who literally were dead for 10 or 15 years on the list. We had people who've lived in the same house for 80 years not on the list. And then you have people who may have lived in my riding or my constituency in the last election are on a list, but then now they live somewhere else. So maybe now they're no longer living in Eastern Passage or Cole Harbour, maybe they're living in Bridgewater, maybe they're living in Enfield. Well, they can put themselves on the list in Enfield and vote, but they also can come back to my riding because there's still someone on the list saying that person is in my riding. And nothing stops them from showing identification and getting the ability to vote in my riding as well. So I show that as an example that when you have a list that is that problematic, a list that has that many errors on it, you're opening yourself up to a lot of serious problems. And I would suggest, in the current state of cynicism towards politics in this country and in this province, Mr. Speaker, as a result of what's happening federally, the last thing we need is a serious case of electoral shenanigans as well. So I'm glad to see these changes. I'm hoping they'll be put in place in time, that we're going to be able to have these for the next election. I guess that depends on a lot of factors, but even if we don't, I think it was clear at the press conference that there will be, they do have currently ability to do certain amounts of enumeration, spot enumerations, to make sure that the list that we have right now would at least be better. But I'd like to see these changes. Our caucus will be supporting it because we see this as important for Nova Scotia to have confidence in the system that elects their officials, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
I recognize the honourable member for Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As Justice Critic for our caucus, it's a pleasure to rise and speak briefly on Bill 145 and the amendments to the Nova Scotia Elections Act. Speaker, I think it's quite clear that, as my colleague from Cole Harbour Eastern Passage mentioned, pretty much every member who's here in this House, whether it's their first trip here or for many of us a returning trip, will have many memories of the voting list in the last election, and unfortunately, for the most part, they are not very fond memories. I can tell you, in Richmond County, when the list first came out, we have just under 9,000 voters in Richmond County, and the list wasn't too bad. We were only missing 3,000 voters from the list. Mr. Speaker, I had my official agent, he and his wife, who married for over 30 years and had been living in Alderney Point on Ile Madame, who weren't on the list. And so the minute we saw that, we immediately brought it to the returning officer's attention. And certainly we're blessed in Richmond County. We have Raymond LeBlanc, who's been a returning officer there for many years and has a tremendous amount of experience from his time on municipal council and being involved in various elections, especially in the provincial side. And he actually agreed to appeal to the Chief Electoral Officer to have an enumeration in Richmond County to avoid a civil war. And in fact, that's what we did in Richmond. We actually did have enumeration so that at the end of the day, for the most part, the list was in good shape. But it certainly wasn't an easy road, and it took his leadership to be able to avoid what certainly would have been a catastrophe, because when in Richmond County, as in many other parts of the province, they take their politics seriously, and they certainly take their right to vote very seriously. And for people who had been married 30 years, living in the same house, not showing up on the list, that's just but one example of the other 3,000 residents of Richmond County who didn't make it on the list. One of the issues in talking about the list, Speaker, and it even became an issue in the operations of a campaign, is the important aspect that after one has run a campaign, the province of Nova Scotia does provide a rebate. If you get so many votes, you get a certain percentage of votes, you are offered a rebate based on the list of electors. It became a major issue in ridings such as Richmond County, and I believe Antigonish was one of them, and a few others, as to at what list was supposed to be used to determine the rebate. Was it the first list that came out? Was it the list just before voting day? Or was it the list after voting day? People had been sworn in. And I can tell you, for places like Richmond County, the difference between the first list and the last list was over 3,000 names. So that certainly was a significant impact on us, and I know that in other ridings it was the same thing. And it's my understanding that with the changes in this act, it's going to address that by saying that the rebate provided to candidates at the end of an election will be based on the final list after voting day. So anyone who's been sworn in on the day of the vote will be added to that list, and that is the figure that will be used to determine the rebate that are provided to candidates in their campaigns. And we certainly know how expensive it is to run a campaign, and there is a role for our province to play to be assisting the democratic process by providing this rebate to candidates and to their campaign teams who've worked so hard. Speaker, I too want to commend the Electoral Commission, who have suggested these changes in light of the difficulties in the last election, and I want to take this opportunity on behalf of our caucus. I believe my colleague from Clare has already done so, but certainly to congratulate Christine McCullough for becoming our new Chief Electoral Officer, and certainly again thank Janet Wilworth, who served this province in that position, I would say with distinction, and thank her for many years of service in what is certainly a difficult position and one that's of extreme sensitive nature. And I do wish Christine McCullough well in that position. Mr. Speaker, there's no doubt the return of enumeration to our province is going to bring stability to the elections. By having an annual list, it will allow for political parties and candidates to be able to review that list, to amend it as there are changes, whether they be deletions, whether they be additions, that can be made by campaign teams prior to a campaign. I too want to encourage the government at looking at the role of returning officers and making sure that they are given ample opportunity to prepare before an election is called, and that they have the necessary resources at their disposal. I know most elections, my returning officer is racing to try to get a computer and the necessary software to get up and running. That's not the position we should be if we are going to treat the position of returning officers in our own constituencies as an important position and one that we want to see some continuity. If I'm not mistaken, there's apparently been a significant turnover in returning officers, because by looking at the papers, I keep seeing advertisements for returning officers in various ridings. So I think it's important that we try to have returning officers who are willing to remain in that position, given the resources to be able to carry out their job, because by remaining in that position, they bring experience with them in each election. One of the final items that I wanted to raise, Mr. Speaker, is that one of the important changes that was made prior to the last election was the whole issue of the proxy vote, and we went with the mail-in ballot. Similar to the federal government, it was a way of replacing that you no longer had to give an excuse why you were not able to vote in person, and you were able to apply for this mail-in ballot. For rural areas, it was a relief, because each election, when you needed someone to get a medical excuse, running to see the local doctor, especially in Richmond County with the doctor shortages we continually have, it was a frustration for the doctors, yet it was important to make sure that our seniors, if they were unable to go vote, or anyone who couldn't go vote due to medical reasons, did have the right to have their ballot cast. I can tell you the mail-in ballot is a good idea, but there are still some refinement that needs to take place to that process. The way it was working in Richmond County is that whoever was going to vote for an individual, for example, had to show up at the returning officer's home, pick up the application package, return to bring it to the constituent, have them fill it out, get the documentation, and then bring it back to the returning officer to be given the ballot and the materials. Now, that may not sound like a complicated process, but when you have one returning office in a riding like Richmond County that takes about an hour and a half drive from one end to the other, it causes a serious problem. Because if you're in Lardouez, or if you're down in Grand River, or if you're over in different further parts, Point Tupper, whichever one, to come to that area, to make a drive to pick it up, go back, come back to drop it off, it just wasn't practical. And what happened is a lot of people said, we're not going to bother, it's too far to travel. So there are different options. Have more than one returning office in larger ridings, which I believe is something that's been discussed, or allow agents appointed by the political parties to be able to pick up the application form, bring it in, to bring it to the constituent, and whoever's going to exercise their vote for them, at that point, maybe that person would only have to make one trip in to receive a returning officer to have it processed. So I think it's something the Commission should look at. We're trying to make sure that all Nova Scotians have an easy a time to vote as possible. We're very concerned about the fact that we have low voter turnouts. The last thing we need to be doing is making our system any more cumbersome, that it would discourage people from voting, especially people who might feel that because they live in more isolated communities that they're not going to bother going through the process to be able to vote. So with that, it's my suggestion of some of the frustrations we saw in Richmond County, but I believe these changes are positive. I think it's something that certainly we'll be giving our support to, and I'm sure that other members of the House may wish to share other proposals or other ideas that they have of their own experiences. And I do look forward to seeing what the Electoral Commission will react to the concerns I've raised and the Chief Electoral Officer. But with that, Mr. Speaker, I again thank the Electoral Commission for their hard work on behalf of all recognized political parties here in this province for advancing our laws forward. There's certainly room for us to make more changes as we are in a more and more of a technical age, and there's been some suggestions along that road, and maybe that debate can take place at another time. But I think it's important that we continue to recognize that we have to our Elections Act should be like our Constitution. It is a living tree. It must be prepared to make changes as necessary and adapt to the realities we find ourselves in this province. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I look forward to the reactions we get at law amendments and any suggested changes, but it would be my intention to support Bill 145. Thank you.
Recognize the honourable member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll be very brief on this particular piece of legislation. I too support this particular piece of legislation because, as we've noticed over the past several years, there have been some refinements that have led to this particular piece of legislation today, and I think the member for Richmond has highlighted several of them, as did the previous speaker to himself. But I just wanted to recapture some of the reasons from a practical point of view, the reasons for these refinements. I recall back in the 1993 election, when enumeration had taken place, the enumerators from all three parties that had taken part in the enumeration process, or two out of the three, two leading party numbers. But then, after that had been done, of course, there are still vacuums in the total number that's on the list, because people move, people die, people, for whatever reason, move to another constituency or out of the province altogether, or indeed some move into the community just shortly to the election. And I recall back in that particular point in time, when the revision list was being dealt with, the enumerators for the NDP caucus or party were in full force in Cape Breton West, and lo and behold, one of the enumerators, who was a resident of Saskatchewan, meant very well, but to try and put on the voters list 38 people who had died as many as 10 to 15 years prior to was a little much for the returning officer. And at the end of the day, the returning officer ordered that particular revision officer for the NDP not to come back to the headquarters anymore unless there was proper documentation. So that's one of the pitfalls that you have when you're dealing with certain political elements. Another pitfall, Mr. Speaker, is, for example, in the last election, as we recall, we went through the redistribution just prior to the provincial election. And of course, there was a leveling off as to how many voters would be in each constituency in order to have the provincial mean average. Well, in my particular constituency, that would be approximately 14,500 max. But when we get into the election, lo and behold, there were 2,000 voters missing. And we really haven't discovered who at least 1,000 of those are till this very day. And I do believe if that we had some enumeration, that perhaps that would have been very helpful. And no, I'm not sure which would have been worse, Mr. Speaker, but at least we're thinking that those 1,000 that were missing were at least living, and had moved on their own accord rather than somebody going to the graveyard looking at headstones to try and put them on a list. And that seemed to be the general focus. But somewhere in between, Mr. Speaker, there is a balance of understanding of fairness to that. I think the point has been made about in previous times where if somebody wanted to vote by proxy vote, then they would always have to go, for example, to the family doctor or to somebody of legal counsel. Well, if you read the form very closely, that's not the absolute requirement. Anyone in the healthcare system, for example, a registered nurse or even a CNA, if they were practicing, they could very well validate those forms. But that was never ever advised clearly to a lot of the enumerators and those that were working for the various respective parties. So I think on that particular form, although we now have mail-in ballots, and that's good that we have that process because more people participate in the process, I do believe that has to be fine-tuned even more so that people are better apprised that commissioners of votes, registered nurses, different professionals that do have the ability to do it. I know we did it in our constituency. There were at least 30 individuals who had taken affidavits, or registered nurses had taken the affidavits for these voters who were going to be voting by proxy. And it was very much legal because that was the interpretation for the returning officer of the constituency. So these are the types of things, Mr. Speaker, that I would hope. I believe going back to some type of enumeration process is very important because there are too many vacuums, and particularly with Canada Post, who is now in the process in some regions of the province making substantial changes to the postal code system in the regions, and they're trying to tie it in at the municipal level by agreement from the local municipalities, and putting everybody online, whether it be through the 911 system or indeed through their postal code system. And many vacuums are created because of that. And in some cases in my constituency, there have been literally hundreds of individuals excluded because the streets were not included, because the postal codes didn't match up to the previous postal codes. And in fact, what happened is they were listed in adjoining constituencies. And that's not very productive at all. So there's some of the issues from a practical point of view I thought I would point out, and I know there'll be certainly some refinements to this particular piece of legislation, and I'll certainly be supporting it, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Dartmouth North.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I had not intended to speak on this piece of legislation because I think the honourable member from Eastern Passage, our colleague in the legislature, had indicated that in fact our political party was supporting the amendments to the Bill 145. And I think it's absolutely correct. We have discussed this piece of legislation, and we have discussed that the amendments and the improvements to this bill, and thanks to the Commission, that in fact these are positive amendments and improvements. I want to say that during the 1993 election campaign, it was we in Dartmouth North were quite concerned with respect to not having access to enumerators at the onset of the campaign, primarily because we represent a constituency where there are a high number of multi-unit residential developments. And as a result of those high number of multi-unit residential developments, the population tends to be transient and move not only through the district of Dartmouth North, but to other constituencies as well. And there needs to be, Mr. Speaker, a stronghold as to where those people or those electors are on the voters list. And it's extremely important for electors to know that they are an important part of the democratic process, and that they are on the electors list, and that they do have the opportunity to cast a ballot. I have to say, though, that in speaking with the returning officer in the district, she acknowledged that, in fact, we did have a concern with respect to the number of transient individuals, and that there would be a need for enumerators to do at least parts of the constituency. She had advised us to make up a list, and we did prepare a list of the number of polling districts that we wanted to have enumerated. Mind you, unfortunately, we only received about half of those polling districts to well, I shouldn't say received, but had approval for at least half of those polling districts to be enumerated, which meant there was a tremendous amount of work placed upon the campaign workers and the canvassers for the campaign team to go out there and do the work that was normally or should normally have been done by government. And I'll tell you, Mr. Speaker, how important it is to make sure that those individuals are on the voters list. For example, we had on election day an individual whom in fact went to the polls. The individual had lived in the constituency for at least 50-some years and had consistently voted for 40 years. Consistently voted. Not only when the individual went to cast a ballot at the polling station on that particular day were they not on the list, but their civic address, their residence wasn't even on the list. As a matter of fact, there was no way that we could convince the returning officer that in fact this residential facility exists, that in fact there was a civic address here that existed. It was only when in fact they had contacted me on election day to go in and do some verifications with a map that they had agreed that in fact there was a civic address and that the individual could then be sworn in to cast a ballot. Thankfully, the individual was prepared to because that individual had voted consistently for 40 years, that they weren't about to give up their democratic right to cast a ballot this time. So they were committed to stay there, Mr. Speaker, and make sure that they were going to exercise their right to vote. After the election campaign had been completed, approximately about 2.5 months, I actually received a call from the returning officer indicating that they were going to do a wrap-up with respect to what we had envisaged as difficulties through this election campaign and what we would recommend. And I have to say that myself and the campaign manager for Dartmouth East went and visited the returning officer at her home, along with the other campaign managers as well. And we talked about those particular things that we think needed to be fine-tuned within the Elections Act. One of the very issues that needed to be fine-tuned within the Elections Act was the revisions of the enumerators list. It is very important to know that in fact we are now going to have a permanent enumerators list, and that in fact no Nova Scotian, for the most part, will feel left out on that voters list, providing that it is done appropriately. And the piece of legislation and the amendments to the legislation indicates that this is going to happen. We are going to not rely upon the federal government for information, but we in this province are going to have an enumeration prior to, and an ongoing enumeration, as a matter of fact, prior to the next provincial election. This can only bode well for those individuals who want to participate in the election process. I can't stand here and tell you that it will increase voter turnout, because we don't know how much of an effect, a good enumeration process might have on voter turnout. I can't tell you that. But I can tell you that if in fact it encourages one additional voter to cast a ballot, then the democratic process has been improved. There has been a positive effect in the democratic process. Mr. Speaker, we will know, based on the number of individuals who have casted their ballot in the 1993 election campaign, and after this enumeration process has taken place, we will know if it has been effective in increasing voter turnout in the future election campaign. That's all we can say. But we as legislators do have a role to improve the democratic process whenever we can. And if that means amendments to the Elections Act that make it easier for Nova Scotians to participate in that democratic process, then that's the way to go. I want to talk a bit about the mail-in ballots. The mail-in ballots tended to have a bit of difficulty because the mail-in ballots, as a previous member of the legislature had spoken, took this cumbersome process whereby you went to the returning officer, you picked up the ballot, you have taken the ballot to the potential elector. The potential elector completed the ballot, filled out the form, then you took it back to the returning officer, then the person who was indicated to vote on that particular day would be casting the ballot. But often there were mix-ups because many people didn't fully understand that mail-in ballot process. We had asked the returning officer to take back to the chief electoral officer our concerns with respect to the mail-in ballot. We had asked him if in fact it could not be simplified or fine-tuned and make it easier to do just the one stop with respect to the mail-in ballot, then this would be the appropriate way to go. The revisions list, the continuous revising of that revisions list, the opportunity to continue to make sure that it's an updated permanent list is in fact something that I can tell you that every campaign office will in fact welcome. There's absolutely no question that we will welcome, because we will not, and our canvassers and our workers will not be spending time trying to do, again, the work of the enumerator should be doing. I think that if one were to calculate, and I can't speak for every constituency because every constituency is uniquely different, but I can speak for my constituency and tell you that if I were to calculate the number of hours that we have spent in putting people on the voters list, making sure that people were eligible to vote on election day, the hours would be enormous. It would at least quantify at least 1/4 of the election time in that 28, 30-day span that we have to run a campaign. Now that's significant for individuals who rely upon canvassers to canvass for them in polls, and particularly individuals like myself, because Mr. Speaker, because of the changes within the boundary of the constituency of Dartmouth North, I seen an expansion of some 1,500 to 2,000 eligible additional voters. And that required, not only did I witness a reduction in the period of time in which I could campaign, but I also seen an increase within the electoral boundary. So I have to tell you, this reflects a positive move. Hopefully, Mr. Speaker, we will be able to measure the changes here in this Elections Act in the next coming provincial election, whenever that may be. So I want to say, similar to my honourable member from Cole Harbour, that this appears to be a good piece of legislation, and that it appears that our members or our party will be supporting this piece of legislation. Having said that, I want to say that we should thank the Chief Electoral Officer, the staff, and the staff of the government departments that in fact acknowledged there needed to be changes and in fact brought them forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Recognized honourable member for Clare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to say a few words on Bill number 145. I think all of us, as elected members of this House, certainly this is certainly welcoming news, because I know in Clare, and I'm sure in every riding across Nova Scotia, in the last provincial election in 2003, there were many people left off the voters list. I just want to share with you, Mr. Speaker, on a few of those complaints that happen in our riding. On the average, Mr. Speaker, we had about 25 people in every poll that were added on to the voters list. That basically represents roughly between 10 and 12% of the voters that did vote. Mind you, not everyone voted, and I'll go in details in a few minutes. But on the average, many people were not on the voters list. I happened to be in one of the polls where this elderly lady walked in to vote. She had been voting for many, many years. In this poll, the returning officer, along with the clerks, knew this lady, and she knew them as well. Unfortunately, she had no voter's card. She had no identification with her, and the returning officer, explained it to this lady that she needed some proof of identification in order to be allowed to vote. Well, I'm not going to repeat what this lady said to these workers in the poll, but I don't believe this lady did vote on Election Day. I don't think she bothered to go back home, pick up her IDs, and come back to the voting polling station. So, again, this was just an example of what did happen. I know in some of our polling stations, people from the same household, from the same family, that normally votes in the same polling station. Unfortunately, in the last election, these people from the same families had to vote in 2 different polls. And again, many people certainly raised these concerns with me. Another concern that I had was the lineups. The lineups at polling stations with people that were waiting to register in order to vote. And I can tell you a lot of people that I've seen did not bother waiting in long lineups in order to register, in order to vote. They came in, saw what was going on, and unfortunately they did not stay behind in order to vote. So again, how many people across Nova Scotia that this happened to them when they went to vote in polling stations, that they refused to wait in order to register to vote. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm glad that the members of the Election Commission, along with the help of the Chief Electoral Officer and staff and people from the department, have looked at these complaints from the last provincial election and have come up with these proposed positive changes. I personally believe that the government has a responsibility to try to encourage as many voters to participate in the electoral process. When you look at the low voting turnout that we had in the last provincial election, I personally don't enjoy it. I don't like it. I don't think any government appreciates low voting turnout. I think it's a responsibility that any government has to try to encourage as many voters to participate in elections and in the electoral process. Mr. Speaker, I just want to share with you and with members of the House, last month I had an opportunity to attend as an observer in Central Africa, to be an observer in a presidential election where there's approximately 4 million people over there. And Mr. Speaker, of course, different countries have different rules come election time. And in this country, it was part of the responsibility of the voter to register. There was no registering at the last minute come election day to vote. Voters had to pre-register in order to vote on election day. Election day over there, Mr. Speaker, takes place on a Sunday. Polling stations opens up at 6 a.m. in the morning until 4 p.m. in the afternoon. And the lineups, it's just amazing, amazing. The participation from the general population over there. Everybody wanted to have a say. It's a big event. In the community that I was in on election day, it was just unbelievable. We had people, and when we were going around different polling stations on election day, I spoke with many voters, how long that they had been waiting to vote. And it was 2, 3, 4 hours. And believe me, it was hot on top of that. So again, when I look at registering, doing enumeration to allow people to vote on election day is certainly welcoming news. Unfortunately, in Nova Scotia, we are allowed to register even on election day of the polling station. So to me and I'm quite sure to many people throughout this province, this is certainly welcoming news. So again, Mr. Speaker, in closing, I'm glad that the Election Commission, that the government is bringing back enumeration to allow as many people to be on the voters list. And I'm quite sure this is certainly welcoming news for everyone, every voter that were left off the voters list across this province back in August of 2003. So, Mr. Speaker, I believe this is welcoming news for all Nova Scotians to bring back enumeration, and I'm quite sure the number of complaints that we encountered in the last election from voters that were not registered on voters lists, this is certainly a step in the right direction. And Mr. Speaker, I will be voting in support of these proposed changes. Thank you.
I recognize the honourable member from Hants East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise and speak on Bill 145. I listened with interest to previous members who spoke, and in particular the member from Clare. I thought his information from his experience in Africa was really worth listening to show that how important it was for people there that they get an opportunity to vote, and that actually that democracy can still mean so much. I for one certainly welcome any change that would be a benefit in terms of voters lists. I, like many of my colleagues here in the House, certainly experienced, calls from voters or would-be voters around the voters list or the inconsistencies in the voters list. And I want to say that the people I ran against in 2003, I think they conducted themselves very well. Both the Liberal candidate and the Tory candidate, they probably ran into the same headaches that I did, and I think quite often, if you're the incumbent, people probably more quickly call your office, and when they run into these. Yeah, right. Well, the finance minister saying that they blame you too, but certainly when you're in opposition, you can certainly deflect that. And I want to say it's not that role. It's not one that I necessarily appreciate. I would very much like to be as distant from all of that as I can, and like to leave that to other people so that the candidate isn't perceived to be too close to any of those lists or whatever. But certainly people, one of the names that comes to mind is the incumbent MLA as someone that they would want to call. And actually, I had reason to want to call myself, actually, that the list that in my own area where I would have been voting, I wasn't even on the list. And I thought that that was hitting pretty low, I thought, by the Tories, that they wouldn't even put me on the list to vote. But and I have to say that even my mother, who is across the road from me, she lives in Enfield, was on the list to vote in Upper Rawdon, which, even as the crow flies, is quite a little hike, and so probably looking at 20 miles anyway, quite a bit out of her way. So I questioned and wondered about how things could get in such disarray. But if the Act will straighten this up, I am certainly pleased, and willing to endorse any process that would improve it. I challenge the member for Cape Breton West while he's here to bring any documents that he can to substantiate his allegations, and I'd be interested to have a look at those.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would respectfully submit there are at least 7 cemeteries in Cape Breton West. You may want to check for the evidence.
The honourable member from Hants East.
My colleague from Coal Harbour, Eastern Passage, I think he was the one, but I might be wrong, but had indicated that to put the idea out there, since our election campaigns are so short, that enumeration actually would be a way to let the public think about an election. When somebody knocks on their door, tries to get information from them, and then, is there going to be an election? Because I'm sure all members of the House, on occasion, after the writ is dropped, that they've knocked on doors and people were unaware that there was an election in process. And so this is one way. This is one way that people actually would turn their mind towards an election, even though it's the latter days, perhaps, before they start to decide. My colleague says only in Hants East, but those people there don't want to lose their MLA, so that's their. They don't want to think about an election. So, I think that I think we quite often don't realize the importance of voting. We tend to think that people are quite cynical about politicians, and that's not to say they haven't had good reason. There's any list of accomplishments or lack thereof of politicians that would make the public cynical. But I want to say that for people who live in a particular community for a long period of time and feel that they are well known, when they go to vote and they're not on the list or they feel they're not being identified, they walk out and they're not interested in coming back. And I really think, to me, that really seems to be a shame that people who are interested in getting out and casting a ballot are put off by the fact that they've been left off the list. And there definitely were lots of occurrences like that. Some things that I would like to see this bill address, if it doesn't, and when I looked through it, I couldn't find it. But rules around people wearing colors of the party when they go to vote. I think that there's quite innocently people go in and have been nabbed because they wore a blue shirt or a red shirt or blouse or whatever, and totally innocent. And I think to give them a hard time on these things is just purely ridiculous in the 21st century. Something I'd like to see some flexibility on, and in particular around the issue of advanced polls, and that's in regard to the First Nations community. We have the community of Indian Brook in Shubenacadie. Quite often, elections occur in the summertime. There's a fairly large contingent of the members of that community who would go to Maine for blueberry harvest, and we tried to get an advance poll for those people, and it wasn't possible, and so that's something I'd like to see some flexibility around. That there's a community of interest there who has a traditional pattern of going or being away for one reason or another for a particular time of year, and so for those communities it would be very nice if they could have an advance poll ahead of their leaving, because they're as interested in voting as anybody else. So if the changes to this act would certainly mean that I'd be on the voters list, I'd be very pleased, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to see the process streamlined enough that people are comfortable, that they have every expectation that they will be on the list. I actually, have a constituency where one section of it is fairly rapidly growing, and there's quite a bit of movement in and out. And so, this would be very important to keep an updated list that's accurate. And I think certainly for all excuse me, certainly for all the parties, it would be less grief at election time if they can turn their attention to practices that would help get their candidate elected, and not be doing the pushing for paperwork that would try to correct some errors in the voters list. So with those few comments, Mr. Speaker, I'll take my place, and I look forward to hearing what other members have to say. Thank you.
I recognize the honourable member from Pictou West.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I too welcome this opportunity. I have just a couple of minutes to speak on the Elections Act, Bill number 145, and I share a lot of the same concerns that previous members have spoken on. And I guess I've had the opportunity to participate in a few elections over the years, municipal and provincial and federal, and I don't think there was an election that compared to the problems that were associated with the 2003 general election, in that so many people were left off the voters list. And in my riding of Pictou West, I estimated there's approximately 25% of the people were not there on the initial list that was provided from the federal list that was available. And that's a lot of people. That was probably around 3,000 people in the riding of Pictou West, and it caused real problems, not just for myself and my team of helpers, but for all three political parties in the riding, and probably for the independent that ran as well. And it's really when people are disenfranchised, the democratic process is not being served the way it should be. And really, when you think about it, our electoral process that we have, our elections are the lifeblood of our democratic system, and it must be fair, and it must be seen to be fair. And if it's not, then people start to wonder if there's something going on that perhaps shouldn't be. And when you go back in history, we have fought long and hard to have a democratic system where people could freely come to the polls and vote. And not that long ago, people were discriminated against. Only men, for example, were allowed to vote. And then at one time there were two well-known political parties in this province, and that they would actually line up at the polls and make it hard for people to vote. They would have their muscle men there, and people would prevent somebody they thought was not of their persuasion from getting into the polling booth. And if you look back through the 1800s, and that was quite common. So we're hoping that as we move along, that the process will become more democratic, and more people have the availability to go into the poll and vote the way they choose, to vote for the candidate of their choice. And I just want to maybe mention a couple things that happened in my riding that were similar perhaps to what happened in other members' ridings. The previous member mentioned about his own name being left off the ballot, and that happened to my family as well. In the poll 32 in Pictou West, my home poll, I went to look at the list, and there was about 20 names on there. There should have been about 250, and there my name wasn't, and that would happen to a lot of other people. So fortunately, we talked to the returning officer, and she agreed to do enumeration in that particular poll. And that happened a lot. It happened all over our riding. I'm sure it happened in other ridings. But I guess the most disconcerting thing was when people that had lived in a community all their lives, went to the poll, and they were told, sorry, your name is not on the list. You're not going to be allowed to vote unless I've got 2 pieces of ID and somebody swears in that you're who you say you are. And that really slows down the process. And if they're fortunate enough to have their driver's license or something on them, then perhaps they could get on the list right then and there. In other cases, though, they actually had to go back home and find their birth certificate or find their driver's license or some other piece of identification, come back, and it just made for lineups of that was unnecessary, especially as you get towards 7 o'clock and the closing of the poll. Then it's holding back, maybe some people from voting, it's holding back the count that needs to take place at that time. There were others in Pictou West that were not on the list, but perhaps had moved away, and they're still just recent movers, and they thought they could still vote because they were there just recently. There were deceased people on the list that had the right to vote, I guess, if they so could. And there were people that were moving through that transients that also perhaps felt they had a right to vote. But anyway, there were lots of problems, and in many ways it was very frustrating for voters and for political parties and for candidates. And when you have a quarter of the electorate not on the electors list, you know there's something wrong. So I appreciate the effort that's gone into this Bill 145. It looks like a vast improvement, and I certainly support what I see so far in the bill. There's mentions in there about the preliminary list will be by both enumeration and by confirmation, and that once a year the returning officer would confirm the list and make sure it's updated, and it's almost a continual process to allow the list to be as fairly accurate as possible. I guess if there's one suggestion, Mr. Speaker, that I would add that I think would be an improvement over the system that we have, maybe it's a small point, but the mail-in ballot worked much better than the proxy system that we had previously. But one other item related to that is before there's a ballot printed, before there are names of the known candidates, there are still some people that would like to be able to vote. They know who's nominated, but they're not actually on a printed up ballot as of yet. And some people are leaving the constituency in the first day or the second day or maybe the first week of the campaign. They're not going to be back before E-Day. And there is an opportunity, I think, for a write-in ballot where they can write the name of the candidate on a blank sheet and give it to the returning officer. But I think that needs to be promoted or advertised a bit better. And it's just for those people that are going to be away for the remainder of that 30-day period and would still like the opportunity to vote. So I guess overall, Mr. Speaker, I support Bill 145. I think it's a major step forward than the debacle, I guess, that we had in 2003 in many ridings, including Pictou West. And the election process certainly must be fair. It must be seen to be fair. It needs to be easier for the voter to get out there and participate in the democratic process. And I think that's their democratic right to make sure they have the opportunity to vote for the candidate of their choice. So I look forward, Mr. Speaker, to the bill going on to law amendments. And at this point, I'm certainly supportive of the bill.
Thank you very much. If I recognize the Honourable Minister of Education, it will be to close debate.
All sides of the House for those informed and insightful comments. I did indeed. I'll watch the video. But this bill does deal with an item of importance to us all. We all had awkward situations with voting lists during the last election. And I would like to congratulate my colleague and with support of the others that this revision is good for Nova Scotia. And with that, Mr. Speaker, and just before sitting down, I would like very much to extend a welcome to you, to your chair. I believe this is your first official visit. And And I will now move second reading of Bill number 145.
Thank you. The motion is for the second reading of Bill 145. Is the House ready for the question? Would all those in favor of the motion please signal by saying aye? All those opposed say nay. The motion is carried.
Bill number 145, an act to amend Chapter 140 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Elections Act.
Be ordered that this bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments.
Mr. Speaker, would you please call Bill number 146, Cross-Border Policing Act?
Bill 146. The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I rise on behalf of my colleague, the Minister of Justice, to move second reading of this Bill 146. As my colleague said yesterday at the bill briefing, this legislation is an important tool to help police investigate criminal activity. Indeed, it's part of a larger national effort to have all provinces adopt model legislation brought forward by the Uniform Law Conference of Canada. The problem now is that police officers lose their official status when they leave their home jurisdictions. This bill sets out the procedures to be followed when a police officer needs to pursue an investigation beyond their own provincial boundaries. And I'm pleased to say that it has the full support of the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police and many other law enforcement organizations. Other provinces, Mr. Speaker, have either adopted similar legislation or plan to do so. The legislation sets out appointment procedures, defines responsibilities of police officers who are pursuing investigations, and also has procedures to ensure effective civilian oversight. It is timely legislation. Just last week, Minister Baker announced that we as a province would help fund the Criminal Intelligence Service of Nova Scotia. This organization will grow from 6 to 26 employees. Their intelligence officers and analysts will work hard to combat organized crime and serious crimes that cost society hundreds of millions of dollars. Our funding investment of $6.1 million over 4 years was widely applauded by the RCMP and all 12 municipal police agencies. That investment in public safety, combined with this legislation, shows our commitment to working closely with police to support safe streets and safe communities. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to move the second reading of this bill.
The Honourable Member from Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to welcome you to the chair as well, because I think it's, having been in that position, I know it has its challenges, but also has its rewards as well. I want to speak for a minute on Bill 146 because it is an interesting piece of legislation, and not the first one to come to this House where we've been told that there's a harmonized legislation where every province, every jurisdiction in Canada, at least provincial jurisdictions, I presume, I'm not sure if the territories apply these as well, have agreed to the wording. And to some extent, that's used as a means of saying, don't touch this. It has to pass as it is because otherwise you're going to muck around with an agreement that's been made by the justice ministers. Well, I must say, but that's just, as a member of this House, as the members of this House, it's our job to pass legislation that's good for Nova Scotia. And I say that not because I have an inherent problem with the concept of this legislation. The legislation itself is good in the sense that it is providing an opportunity where officers from other provinces are coming to hear police officers. They have an opportunity to have the powers to act, whether it's investigating, whether it is interviewing, whether it is other means of investigation that they may be doing, Mr. Speaker. And that's important. That's a good thing, because we need to clarify those rules, but not in the same time, given the nature of criminal activity, not only organized crime, but internet crime, it's probably very likely that the need for this kind of agreement will increase. But Mr. Speaker, so I don't have a problem with the legislation as a concept. Though I do want to note in my remarks, Mr. Speaker, some specific points that I think, having read the legislation at first glance, I may have a few concerns with, and I'm hoping that someone from the Department of Justice is noting this, and if I'm way off base, I'm sure they will clarify before law amendments, but if not, there might be an opportunity to discuss this at law amendments. Mr. Speaker, I want to start by saying, let's talk about the concept. Basically, if an officer from another province, and someone said to me today, well, is this only Canadian? What about Americans or Interpol? Or no, this only applies to provinces, Mr. Speaker, officers from other provinces. If they want to come here because of an investigation and they want to have the authority to do what they need to do, they have to apply to what's called an appointing officer, Mr. Speaker. And under Part 1 of the Act, they can apply to appointing officer, and that appointing officer, in writing, they have to spell out why they need to come here and what exactly is the purpose of their trip. And in return, Mr. Speaker, the appointing officer then has to say yea or nay within 7 days. Provide them with that in writing, and then they have the ability to come here with any conditions. Seems simple enough. Now, there are certain emergency situations where maybe they need to be here for, and I must say that first group, Mr. Speaker, when it's in writing, they can have that power for up to 1 year. That's a fair amount of time, 1 year. I actually would suggest to you that seems like an awfully long time. I could see maybe 6 months with 1 renewal, or 3 months with 2 renewals, or 4 renewals, Mr. Speaker, but 1 year to give carte blanche an opportunity to come here and for a year and act as a police officer seems like a fairly lengthy period of time. So I make that as a note to start with. But if it's an emergency, they can get the power for 72 hours to come here as an officer. So they need to come here maybe because they've heard that there's someone who's in the province and they're in the middle of a very hot investigation, Mr. Speaker. In those cases, they don't have to have it in writing, but they do have to either orally or in writing request why they want to be here. And again, it can be provided to them in a certain form, and approval is given, Mr. Speaker. So those are the 2 main forms of how this would work. And I have a few comments about those. To start with, there's something called an appointing officer in this Act, and not getting into the detail of the legislation, but as a principle. Appointing officer, Mr. Speaker, should be someone who I would suggest is a very high command, at the least a local detachment head. I would expect it to be higher, a chief of police, maybe even higher up. But in this legislation, it's clear that it's defined as any police officer in Nova Scotia can be an appointing officer. Now, I understand that as a condition, you want the appointing officer to be a police officer, but I would suggest they have to be more than that as well. They should have to have a certain rank, they have to have a certain level of command, because I can see an opportunity, and maybe it is a fairly rare opportunity, where in this province you could have an appointing officer who is just a plain officer, a constable, who would be an appointing officer. I have a concern with that, and I think that we need to ensure for accountability, for the issuing of these particular certificates to allow people to come here and act as officers in our province, which is a fairly powerful right. We need to ensure that there are certain checks and balances put in place. That would best be served by having an officer of some responsibility, a police chief, a detachment head, someone like that, Mr. Speaker, who would then be in a position and understand the accountability that goes with the job, not just any officer. And my reading of the legislation is any officer can take on that job at the moment, and I would have a concern with that. I think it's also important to note that when an appointing officer makes that decision, they don't have to get the approval of the Minister of Justice. And I'm not sure they need to. They just have to provide notice. But it goes back to the point that the Minister of Justice is not signing off on these special appointees who come here. No one higher up in the Department of Justice is doing that. This is being done by an appointing officer. Again, another reason why that officer should be someone who has a certain level of rank, a certain level of authority and responsibility beyond just any officer in this province. I also want to say that when we talk about the emergency appointees, ones for up to 72 hours, Mr. Speaker, it says it can be done orally or in writing. I understand in certain circumstances, in a rush, you may need to do it orally, but I would suggest maybe in those circumstances it has to be followed up in writing, the request and the appointment, or refusal, presumably, within 24 hours. Because to have it done orally means that if an officer from Manitoba or Saskatchewan or Ontario or Quebec wants to come here and they call up and on the phone say, here are my reasons for wanting to come to Nova Scotia, there's no real record. There's no real record of what they were doing, because you could have problems later on. 72 hours, maybe it's only 72 hours that they have the authority, but in that 72 hours they can do a lot of things. And to not have a written record of their request, again, for the purposes of not slowing it down, given the sort of circumstances, the emergency circumstances, I'm not saying they have to apply in writing, but I would suggest that maybe it would be a good idea to say that if they do apply orally within 24 hours, there will be a written request followed up. I think that would be a good way of ensuring that we do actually have a written record of what the request was, so that there's no problems later on. Mr. Speaker, also, when we talk about the one-year appointment, there is a clear deadline. Within 7 days of receiving the request, the appointing officer has to provide a response, yes or no, in writing. But for the emergency one, there is no deadline. It says that the appointing officer has to respond as soon as reasonably possible. Well, anyone who has any experience either in this House and reading legislation or as a lawyer will know that as soon as reasonably possible, you can drive a truck through. What does that mean? So I would say that maybe there's a need to put some sort of time limit on it, 12 hours, 24 hours, so that those officers in other provinces know they're going to get a timely response and not just as soon as reasonably possible. Because if it's Friday at 4 o'clock when you get the phone call and you don't respond to them until Monday at 9 a.m. or noon, you may say that's reasonable, but someone who's in another province who's trying to is in pursuit of someone or a witness or someone who's alleged to have committed a crime, I would suggest that they would say that that's not a reasonable amount of time. So those are issues that relate to that, Mr. Speaker. I also want to note that when there's a power here to terminate, when someone is, as an appointed officer from another province comes here, does things that they're not supposed to, they can be terminated, and that's good. But I want to note that when there's a termination done, that you have to send that termination notice to the person who's been appointed, obviously, to that person's extra-provincial commander. So the person who's in charge of that, maybe a police chief or whomever in that province. So it could be the chief of police of Calgary if it's a Calgary police officer, or the head of the RCMP provincially in Saskatchewan, and to the minister here. All good. I would suggest it wouldn't be a bad idea to also send a copy of that termination to the Minister of Justice in that province to which that officer is based. And I suggest that because there may be circumstances in which that officer has done things that are fairly serious in this province, and to send it to the chief of police or to their head of detachment in that to the department in which they belong, Mr. Speaker, obviously is good for internal discipline purposes, but frankly, that doesn't allow necessarily for accountability of that department. I would suggest if I was the Minister of Justice in a province, and if that's, for example, the Minister of Justice in Alberta, and a police officer from Calgary came to Nova Scotia and had to have his appointment revoked because he or she was doing things they weren't supposed to, I would want to know about that, because I would want to ask the police chief in Calgary what they're doing to ensure that this won't happen again, and what discipline is going to take place, because this potentially is an embarrassment for that province, not just for that police department. So I would suggest sending it to the Minister of Justice or the Minister in charge of police services in a province in which that appointee comes from would also be a good idea. And I suggest that as well, Mr. Speaker. So these are all things that obviously in law amendments maybe people will come forward and speak on. But I put them on the record now because as principle, I do like this legislation, but I do see specific issues that need to be addressed prior to bringing this back. And again, if someone in the Justice Department can tell me that there are other means of addressing this, or that my concerns are being addressed in other ways, that's fine. But I put them on the record because I look at this and I say, I like this legislation, but there are certain little details that concern me. And it's in the, as people like to say, the devil is in the details, Mr. Speaker, and I see in this legislation opportunities for the devil to rear his ugly head, Mr. Speaker. So we will support this legislation. We would like to see it move forward to law amendments to hear where people are coming from. I would ask for the record that the Department of Justice and the Minister of Justice at some point respond to some of the concerns I've raised prior to law amendments dealing with any amendments, because I think it's important that we do understand exactly what this legislation is saying so that we do have the details in place to make sure that this is working not only for us, but frankly, for all jurisdictions in Canada. Thank you.
Thank you. Recognize the honourable member for Richmond.
Thank you, Speaker. As Justice Critic for the Liberal Caucus, I take this opportunity to say a few words on Bill 146, an act to facilitate interjurisdictional policing in certain circumstances. And as has been indicated, we are told that this is part of the uniform law changes that are being adopted throughout the country, or at least hoping that they will be adopted throughout the country. My understanding, I believe, from the minister is only one jurisdiction has adopted it at this point. I believe Manitoba is that jurisdiction, and I'd be curious to know, because we have passed a couple of bills along this, and I know Nova Scotia each time was either first or second in passing them, and I'm curious as to where those bills are at in other provinces. And the issue being, is this uniform law being adopted by other Canadian jurisdictions, or at the end of the day, are we passing bills that aren't really going to work because the other provinces aren't buying into the changes that are being made? And I would hope that the minister might be able to give us a bit of a sense as to where those bills are in regards to other provinces, and why it is that we seem to be, which is a good thing, that we are showing a bit of leadership in being second or third in doing it, but why are the other provinces reluctant to bring forward this, adopt this kind of legislation? And maybe there's more to it that we're not aware of, but it would be interesting to hear his comments on that. You know, Mr. Speaker, there's no doubt that any sort of legislation that's going to allow police in Nova Scotia or police in other jurisdictions to be able to do their job more effectively in pursuing investigations is something that one would naturally expect to support. I'd have a hard time coming up with an argument as to why one should not support that type of notion. So I don't see this bill encountering any sort of great deal of opposition because of that. But, Mr. Speaker, one of the things that this does touch on is the whole issue of crime and the whole issue of safety in our Nova Scotia communities. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, that recent events in the past number of weeks and months have caused Nova Scotians to raise concerns about the safety of our communities. And that's unfortunate, because Nova Scotians are used to living in a province where safety is something that is just accepted. That it is safe to go into your home at night. It is safe to walk along your local street. It is safe to walk along the streets of Halifax. And suddenly in the last few weeks, that seems to be changing. And one of the things that we are looking forward coming into this House was to see what initiatives was the government going to bring forward to bring back safety to our communities, bring back safety here to the city of Halifax. And unfortunately, to date, and maybe there's more to come, but to date, we are not seeing that. The announcement that was made regarding the Criminal Intelligence Service is a good announcement, and it will deal with organized crime and some of the more major crimes that take place in this province. But what we've been hearing the last few weeks, I don't think anyone would suggest that it's based on organized crime. It seemed to be random acts of violence that we're not used to seeing here in this province. And the question is, what can we do as legislators? More importantly, what can the government do with the resources it has to try to bring back a sense of safety and security to our communities? We're not used to hearing of swarmings. We're not used to hearing of violent robberies. Each morning we wake up. The odd one has happened, but lately it seems that every morning you wake up and you hear on the radio that there's another incident that is taking place. That's not something that we're used to seeing in this province, and that's not something I think we want to continue to see happen in our province or in our communities. And one of the frustrations, Speaker, and there's another bill that's going to be brought forward for debate later, talks about new offenses that are being created to deal with youth who get in crime. And my question was to the minister, is at what point is this minister going to stand in his place and say, here are the investments and here are the changes my government is prepared to make to work with our youth, to try to offer them the counseling, the services, the programs, to work with them when they are at risk, to make sure that they do not commit crime, make sure that they do not go down the road that we don't want to see them go down, make sure that they can become productive members of society. And we don't hear that. What do we hear from this minister and from this government is we got to either create new offenses or we got to go up to Ottawa, and I'm going to bring a couple of
members with me, and we're going to stand there and we're going to blame the Young Offenders Act for all the troubles we have in the province. No one's buying that, Mr. Speaker. You know, every time the minister does that, you know, it's almost a farce to see him do that, when we know that there are different initiatives he could be doing in the province that he's failing to do. Let me give you an example. This is the government that first in 1999 said, we're going to get tough on crime. The minister came in, he said, vote for the Conservatives and we're going to get tough on crime. So what does the government do? Start closing all the rural jails, close all the rural courthouses, close the one in St. Peter's that I had. I believe the member from Inverness may have lost some. No, he's still got Port Hood for now. Not sure how much longer that'll last once the Port Hawkesbury facility is up and running. I might lose the remaining one I have in Richmond as well. But close them all around the province. And yet this is the government's going to get tough on crime. So then they go a step further and they shut down the Shelburne Youth Facility. Regardless of the fact they had a sitting member there and the importance it was to that community and the fact the government was saying we're going to get tough on youth crime, they shut down the facility. I believe they saved approximately $1.3 million. That's $1.3 million that's no longer going to Shelburne. The question, Mr. Speaker, that I have is how much of that $1.3 million has gone into youth programs, into youth crime prevention strategies, into counseling, and into programs available to help our youth before they actually commit crimes. No one's answered that question yet. I would submit to you, Mr. Speaker, that little to no money of that money has gone back to work with our kids in our education system and in our communities, and to try to make sure that when they are at risk, that we can do our best to try to put them back on the right track and offer them the services that they require in order to be able to do that, rather than continually creating new offenses to either incarcerate them or to somehow get them punished in front of the law. One of the things, Mr. Speaker, that I'd like to hear from the Minister of Education, I know it's him that's introducing this bill, but this would be something that maybe he can provide us some information on, is how well is the new youth treatment facility working in Truro? And can he provide us statistics which show us that that facility is working the way it should be working? Or will he stand in his place and admit to us that in fact that facility is not meeting the needs that it was set up to meet? And one of the main issues has been the location of that facility, that it is not as accessible as what it should be to those who need it most in our province, and that a lot of government money and time was spent on building a facility that in the end is not meeting its objective. And being the fact that it's either in his riding or in the member for Colchester North, but I do believe it's in the Minister of Education's riding, that he would be able to tell us exactly, is that facility meeting the needs that it was set up and intended to? And I think the answer is no. So until this government starts to give us an indication of what they're prepared to do, other than creating new offenses, because that's not a solution, creating new offenses. The solution is to try to work with our youth before they get into trouble with the law, so that we can make them as productive members of society and that they can contribute to this. And is the treatment center in Truro working the way it should be? If it isn't, then let's see what changes need to be made to make sure that we can have that facility operating the way it should be operating, that the staff that are there are seeing as many of our youth as possible who need their services, because all indications that I've received to date is that that's not taking place, and that facility is not having the success that it was intended to have to start off with. So with that, Mr. Speaker, we do look forward to seeing exactly what initiatives that this government is prepared to bring forward in this session, not only to create new offenses, not only to work on organized crime, and I find it interesting that they're putting more money in organized crime, yet they don't want to ban on VLTs because organized crime is going to run all the VLTs, so I'm not sure how they're going to be able to take care of organized crimes. They're afraid that organized crime is going to run all the VLTs in this province. It seems to be a bit of a contradiction there, that we're going to control organized crime, yet we fear that they'll take over this province in the illegal gaming. But the message is, we have a serious problem there. Nova Scotians do not want to wake up in the morning to hear about swarmings, to hear about violent robberies, and to hear about violence on our streets in this province. This government has an opportunity to show leadership, to take action, and and to make our community safer and to make Nova Scotians satisfied that when they do go out at night and when their children are out at night, that they are out in a safe environment and that we continue to enjoy the peaceful living that Nova Scotians are so proud of here in this province. So I look forward to this bill moving on to law amendments to see if there's any proposed changes at that point, and I do certainly hope that while this is only the second day in this session, that we will see better leadership coming from this government in making our communities safer. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Recognize the honourable member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's a pleasure for me to rise here today to speak on an act to facilitate interjurisdictional policing in certain circumstances, Bill number 146. And Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Justice Minister and the Honourable Speaker from Cumberland South myself did go to Ottawa in January to speak to Justice Minister Irwin Cotler. And I know the member from Richmond doesn't think we accomplished anything. But one of the things we did accomplish up there, we had a prior meeting set up as a sideline meeting with the Canadian Police Association. And the Canadian Police Association at that time were lobbying for us to introduce this bill. Now this bill, there's only one in Canada, and that is in Manitoba. And it's from the uniform law. And when you have legislation, the problem with legislation is not uniformity across Canada. So we want to be geared by the uniformity that governs all provinces. And Mr. Speaker, in this legislation, the member from Eastern Passage, Cole Harbour, and I must say he read this because he's interested in this. And you could tell by the way he was talking. And that's all I'm going to say about that. However, I will say that he did bring out a couple of good points, and which I agree. Sometimes, even though it's a uniformity law, sometimes we have to be looking at the picture of maybe we can make a better difference in bringing in some amendments. And he alluded to two that I was listening to intensely. And one of the two was the appointing officer. And the member from Cole Harbour Eastern Passage is a little concerned at who could be an appointing officer. And I agree. And I think that this could be overcome. And by the simple statement that fact, by changing it to all appointing officers must be commissioned officers. And I would support a change to that. And also in the emergency on the 72 hours, either orally or written notification, that you could have it orally. However, like he says, 72 hours is quite a space, so you could follow that up in writing, have someone follow that up in writing within 24 hours. But one thing we have to remember, that we can be followers or we can be leaders when it comes to legislation. And I would hope that in Nova Scotia that we would be leaders, and especially leaders in crime and crime prevention. You know that crime has no borders, but in police they do, except the RCMP, who are governed by the RCMP Act, and which they can go from province to province because of their act. But other police forces in all of Canada cannot. Once they cross from Nova Scotia to New Brunswick, they are no longer police officers. They are restricted on their investigations, and this would give them the authority to carry on investigation in another province if they have an act similar to this. Now, when you're passing uniform legislation, there has to be a starting point. Now, the starting point was actually in Manitoba, and we'd be second to enact this. And I think there's going to be opposition from Quebec. So, having said that, there shouldn't be any opposition from Quebec, but I think there might be, because in the Ottawa Hall area, you have organized crime is prevalent there. You have about 12 police forces there that's policing that area, and the criminals are crossing borders and back, and the other people don't have the authority. The police don't have the authority to move in the pattern that the criminals move. So this is very important legislation. It's important legislation because as we enter into technology, into the internet technology, in the era where we're moving now, money follows the source. And the crooks will always follow the money. And where is the money? It's in the IT technology. So having said that, this is very important. It's very important for the police force of Canada. It's very important for the citizens of Nova Scotia that we pass this legislation. It's very important that we be leaders, not followers, when we're doing legislation. And I support this fully, and I know that other provinces will come on stream, but there has to be a starting place for this. And as I said, and I realize that we can't change the gist of the bill, but we can make alterations such of amendments to things that maybe the Uniform Law Society overlooked when they did this, and that we can make it a better piece of legislation. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the Honourable Minister of Education to close debate on Bill number 146.
On behalf of my colleague, the Minister of Justice, I'd like to thank the opposition members and my colleague, the member from Colchester North, for their comments on this bill, and I now move second reading.
Question has been called. Motion is for second reading on Bill number 146. Would all those in favor signify by saying aye? Contrary minded, nay. Motion is carried. We need the clerk to. Okay, well, I'll order this bill referred to the Committee on Law Amendments, and I'll recognize the Government House Leader.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, would you please call Bill number 147?
Bill number 147, recognize the Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my privilege to move second reading of Bill 147, and I rise on behalf of the Minister of Justice, whom, as members may know, this afternoon is attending a swearing-in ceremony for a new Justice of the Supreme Court. So I appreciate the chance to do this. As you will remember, I was responsible for the Justice portfolio not all that long ago. And I know that these are important issues, not only to us as elected members, but to people in every community across our province. And this bill speaks about accountability. When it comes to driving a vehicle, we need to learn at a young age that there are deadly consequences when we make mistakes behind the wheel. And this legislation gets us closer to where we need to be. We are proposing that 16 and 17-year-old youth be treated as adults if they are charged under the Motor Vehicle Act or any other motor vehicle-related offense designated in regulations. There are, unfortunately, some youth in that age group who feel that they can fail to show up for court appearance without consequence. Police are then forced to execute an arrest warrant just to find the youth and to bring him or her to court. And this must stop. Like adults, 16 and 17-year-olds need to realize the full consequences of failing to show in court. Like adults, if they fail to show, the courts will be able to enter convictions against them. It's the responsible thing to do. We are also proposing that all drivers face tougher license revocations for stealing a motor vehicle or for taking one without the owner's consent or knowledge. The penalty for a first offense now is that their license can be revoked for 1 year. That will double to 2 years. For a second offense, the penalty is now a 2-year revocation. It will jump to 5 years. those are much more serious consequences. They are in line with how other serious driving offenses are treated. It should send a strong signal to those who might feel now immune from tough penalties. 5 years is a long time to be without a driver's license. Another amendment deals with the authority of police to impound vehicles used in a race. Police would be required to impound the vehicles involved. First offense for 24 hours, second offense for 30 days. This too speaks to the issue of accountability, not only on the driver's behalf, but vehicle owners need to be responsible when they decide to turn their keys over to a friend or a neighbor. In summary, these are changes we believe will improve the justice system. Now, I know if Mr. Baker were here, he would publicly acknowledge the contribution of the member from Cole Harbour Eastern Passage in drafting this legislation. We believe it's important to act and change what we're able to do from a provincial standpoint. We continue to call for wider changes to the Federal Youth Criminal Justice Act and the Criminal Code. We need tougher laws and more suitable options for the courts when they deal with a small percentage of what we call out-of-control youth. The Federal Justice Minister and other provinces are giving this all due consideration. We believe it's not only important to lobby for change at the federal level, but to take action where we have jurisdiction. And Mr. Speaker, I believe this bill accomplishes that. I look forward to hearing comments from other members. So, Mr. Speaker, I move second reading.
Thank you. The Honourable Member for Eastern Passage. Cole Harbour, Eastern Passage.
In the late hour, I do have numerous comments to make on Bill number 47.